On to the round of 32, previewing Kansas Gonzaga.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm Derek Johnson. Give me a follow at DJohnsonRadio on Twitter. You can find our show here with Locked On Jayhawks anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page where you can like and subscribe to the show. Thank you for making it your first listen every day. Thank you to the everydayers out there tuning into each and every episode. We just had a recap episode of KU escaping in the first round. You can also check out Andy Patton, does great work with Locked On College Basketball and with for the Gonzaga side of things, if you want to see the other side of things here. But on today's edition, we're previewing the Kansas-Gonzaga game from the KU point of view. We're going to get to our storylines, Gonzaga scouting report, matchups of the game, players matchup, and Hawks to soar on this episode of the show. First, this episode is brought to you by Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Ever wonder what adventure could be around the next corner? Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Check them out today at nissanusa.com. So storyline number one here, obviously this is the second round of the NCAA Tournament, spot in the Sweet 16 on the line. I think to a certain degree, I mean, obviously from the Gonzaga standpoint, they're trying to keep their incredible stretch alive where they have, I forget what the exact number is. It's like 7 or 8 consecutive like Sweet 16s. I don't know, maybe even be like 9. It is like an unworldly streak that they're on. Like usually you're going to have a team that something's going to go weird in one of the first 2 rounds in an NCAA tournament game where you're going to get upset or you're just going to have a bad matchup here or there, like over the course of basically a decade. But they've been able to get by those in the first 2 rounds, and they're trying to keep that stretch alive. They've been so good at doing it. From the Kansas perspective, it almost feels like a win here, like validates the season a little bit. Like still they were the preseason number 1 team. And if they end up on the season winning this Sweet 16 or winning the second round game, going to the Sweet 16 and then losing, and they finished 24-11 at that point, I don't think people are going to step back and be like, yeah, that was an amazing season. They hit all their expectations and stuff. But I think there would be a lot more of just like, okay, like it was a fine season. They made the second weekend. They made the Sweet 16. Like from where we were a week ago, 2 weeks ago, and some of the injuries they had to battle and how thin the team was and everything. The expectations change a little bit, I guess. So like to a certain standpoint, if you win this game, you are kind of playing with house money from here on. And maybe you already are because you're an underdog to Gonzaga, right? There's also not a ton of Mark Few, Bill Self meetings. The only one I can think of is the 2020 to 2021 season opener on Thanksgiving. That was a game that if it ends up being a little bit like this one, then maybe it ends up being a lot of fun because that was obviously a great Gonzaga team. They ended up losing in the national title, which was their first loss of the year. But that was a very high-scoring game. There was the season opener for both teams, I think, on Thanksgiving Day. 102-90 was the final score. For Kansas, like Marcus Garrett had like over 20 points. Ochai Agbaji had like 17. Bryce Thompson off the bench looked really good with 12. Just kind of interesting. How about Tyon Grant Foster, who's now in Grand Canyon? He had 3 points off the bench for Kansas in that one. Just kind of interesting. But we haven't seen this series a lot. It was very possible the two could have met earlier this year in the Maui Invitational, but didn't end up happening. This is also interesting because it's kind of the battle of no bench. Like neither of these teams has a deep bench, and it's even thinner for Kansas. Kansas is 315th in the country per KenPom in bench minutes, whereas Gonzaga is actually lower on that. They're 343rd, but that's based on the season numbers. Now that Kevin McCullough is injured and out for the tournament for Kansas, the bench is even one guy less, right? It's even that much more thin. It's even that much less deep. So neither of these teams play a deep bench. The good news for Gonzaga is that they're more adjusted to the time zone. They had the earlier game than Kansas did. This is kind of it's the second game of the day on Saturday. So those are things that favor Gonzaga. They also didn't have to sweat it out at the very end. Like Gonzaga is going to be the more rested team coming into this, and they have the longer layoff in between, and they have more of the home court advantage. It sounded like a road game for KU playing against Samford. That's because Gonzaga had the closer. So it's certainly, even though Kansas is the better seed, the 4 seed, Gonzaga is the 5 seed, Gonzaga is favored. They're ranked higher on some of the analytics sites and stuff. Gonzaga has been given more of the favors of, where the game is, the location of everything, fan attend, all that sort of stuff in this game that makes it for even more challenging for Kansas, certainly. The Gonzaga scouting report, 26-7 on the season. They're a top 15 team on KenPom. There is a little bit for Gonzaga. I think some similarities you could point to with Kansas, not just the kind of thin bench this year, but Gonzaga is a team who goes in, year out, being like, hey, we have Final Four standards. we want to be one of the 5 best teams in the country, whatever it is. Like, they have very lofty standards, same way Kansas does at this point in time. And both teams, to a certain standpoint, were kind of underperforming. The difference, though, is Gonzaga really sprinted to the finish line here going into the tournament. They went 14-2 in the West Coast Conference, lost the conference title in the regular season and the postseason tournament to St. Mary's, who's also a very good team. And for a while, there was like talk of Gonzaga being a bubble team. Are they going to make it? Because everybody knew they were a good team, but the resume, they didn't take advantage of their opportunities. They were 0-5 against KenPom top 60 teams until they got a win at Kentucky. And that kind of jump-started things. They finished hot, including their first-round win in the tournament. They've won 10 of their last 11 games, and this is a team who right now is playing like one of the better teams in the country. Things have just started to click for them. I don't know how much of it was, causation of, well, you won the Kentucky game and that was like the confidence boost that they needed to be like, see, we can beat some of the best teams in the country. But certainly since, I don't know, really February, like you go on Bart Torvik, since the start of February, they're the 10th best team in the country on Bart Torvik, and they have the 3rd best offense in that range. So they're playing good basketball coming into this game. What they do well, they are a top 10 offense in the country, top 10 in effective field goal percentage and 2-point percentage. They're top 70 in 3-point percentage. Low volume, though, but they just shot lights out in their last game against McNeese State. They are top 25 in avoiding turnovers and blocks, so they avoid getting like chaotic plays against them. And they're nearing the top 50 in offensive rebound rate. So they do a good job at getting possessions. They're efficient. It's just overall a good offense. They just do so many things well. And then again, when they're shooting the ball really well from 3, like in the McNeese State game, when they go 10 of 21 from 3, it's hard to beat them. And they've had some kind of ups and downs lately there. St. Mary's game in the loss in the West Coast Conference Championship, they were 2 of 11. They lose the game by 9. Game before that, they go 11 of 20 in the WCC semis, and they win that game big. So they've had some other games like 15 of 33 against Portland, but they've had some down games, 2 of 20 against Santa Clara, 5 of 24 against Mississippi Valley State. And it goes on and on and on for kind of the ups and downs for the offense. Defensively, they're not quite as strong as the offense, but they are still top 50 because they are top 25 in effective field goal percentage defense, thanks to a top 15 2-point defense, an above average defensive rebound rate, and doing a great job not sending the opposition to the line. What they haven't done well offensively, really the only negative is they are below average in getting to the free throw line, and they're only like average in free throw percentage, but everything else they do very well. Defensively, they don't force many turnovers. 3-point defense hasn't been great this year for them, which kind of makes sense because they play 2 bigs. And they don't get a ton of chaos creating stats, not a ton of blocks, not a ton of steals. Also good to keep in mind when you're going through some of the stats for Gonzaga, they are against WCC opponents. So some of the raw non-adjusted numbers, like the offense efficiency, the defense efficiency, that's adjusted. But like when you see, they're, say 5th in this specific category. Well, if they're playing in a power conference, maybe that would be 15th, right? Who knows? So they are still very good. I don't want to take away from that, but sometimes that does kind of mix some of the individual stats, which maybe we saw for like the McNeese State game, for instance. Okay, the personnel for Gonzaga, Ryan Nembhard, he is the Creighton transfer. He's been on an absolute heater over the last month or two. He averages about 13 points, almost 7 assists, 4 rebounds, 45% shooting, 32% from 3. He can keep you honest in there. He has 42 assists over his last 4 games. He's been a maestro working those ball screens and in transition for the Gonzaga offense. Then you have 6'2" Nolan Hickman is his backcourt mate. He goes for around 14 points per game on 41% from 3. They have a Swiss Army knife at 6'8" in Anton Watson. Plays the 3 and the 4, averages over 14 points, 7 rebounds, almost 3 assists, 1.5 steals per game, over half a block per game, does a little bit of everything. 58% from the field, 40% from 3, and he's an excellent defender too. Just really good winning player for Gonzaga. 6'10", 230-pound Ben Gregg occupies the 4. He goes for 9.5 points, 5.5 rebounds. He's a knockdown spot-up shooter though for his size. 37% from 3 on over 100 tries per game. Gregg might play a handful of minutes as kind of the backup 5'2", but most of those are going to go to the starter, 6'9", 240-pound Graham Ike. Wyoming transfer, 16.5 points per game, more than 7 rebounds, 61% from the floor, very efficient, back to the basket, post-up scorer, and he's also 78% at the line. So if you foul him, he's going to convert. It is a short bench for Gonzaga, but you will see a couple freshmen. 6'10" freshman Braden Huff. He gets about 9.5 points per game. He can shoot the 3 a little bit. And 6'6" freshman wing Dusty Stromer, who is just basically a bench shooter, 5 points per game, and he's shooting in the mid-30s from 3. All right, let's get to our matchups of the game, player matchups, and Hawks to soar on this episode of Locked on Jayhawks. First, we are brought to you by Nissan, this week's March Madness bracket highlight. Each week, we're picking one team that stands out, a team that's pushed it further than the rest. Just like any of the all-new 2024 Nissan SUVs, these guys were able to take it to the next level. The Houston Cougars can only be described as an Armada. This top-seeded team is as hardcore as it gets out there, so it's no wonder why they earned a 1 seed, why they won the Big 12 regular season, and why they're looking to go far in the NCAA tournament. Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. This episode is also brought to you by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tournament. Whether you're betting on the big upset or a 1 seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all, who's going to make a Final Four, who's going to make a Sweet 16 or an Elite 8, who's going to win Final Four MOP or their region's MOP. You can make your own same-game parlay, build it with players from this game. I think maybe a little bit more of a high-scoring game again in this one, maybe not as much as the last one for KU, but that could mean a lot of good props to go with in this game. And you can do that by visiting FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the Locked On Network. Let's get to our matchups of the game. Player matchups, Hawks to soar on this episode of Locked on Jayhawks. KU will be playing at 2:15 Central Time. So, I don't know, Salt Lake City on Pacific Time or Mountain Time, whatever it is. If you're out there, enjoy. Anyway, number one, this game comes down to the defensive end for me from the Kansas perspective. And Kansas has been a better defense than they have been an offensive team. So I guess from that standpoint, it's good. You wouldn't know it by the way they give up threes because that's kind of the big bugaboo. They're 13th in adjusted defensive efficiency. If this was like a better three-point defense, this would probably be like an elite defense. Unfortunately, they're not. And, the offense ranks in the 60s. But anyway, there's a lot here with defending Gonzaga. They have a bunch of different guys that can score in different ways. They have a great 2-point offense, so you have to play good 2-point defense. You have to do a good job defending ball screens. You have to do a good job getting out on the perimeter because, again, Gonzaga is not a team who shoots a ton of threes, but they can hit them at high efficiency, as you saw just last game. And Gonzaga's 7 worst offensive efficiency games of the season are all losses so far this year. Now, that's not that uncommon when you look at a lot of teams and say, oh, you're whatever X worst offensive games, you lost them, because that makes sense. When you play really bad on one end of the court, like, it increases your chance of losing. But there's some teams where it's like, hey, in their, say, 7 worst offensive games, they went 2-5 or they went 3-4, which again isn't great, but it's like they still can find ways to win when the offense isn't fully on, even though it's harder. With Gonzaga, that hasn't been the case. Like when you can slow down the offense, that's kind of their avenue to winning. So certainly some interesting matchups for KU. It's easier said than done, but I don't know. I'd assume Hunter Dickinson will be on Graham Ike, which will have kind of the post-on-post guy. I'm assuming KJ Adams will be on Ben Gregg, which, Gregg will have a 3-inch height advantage, but KJ's used to playing against bigger centers from last year, and he'll be able to be mobile out there and you'd assume get out to him on the 3-point line. Furphy versus Anton Watson, that's kind of the vet versus the young guy, so that could be a tough one for KU. This would be a great matchup for Kansas if they had Kevin McCullough and, could put him on Anton Watson. That would really help, but obviously that's not doable in this game. And then, they'll have their 2-guard Nolan Hickman on either El Marco or Nick Timberlake. Like, that could be tough a little bit for Kansas on the defensive end. Dajuan Harris on Ryan Nembhard. This is a game that Dajuan is to really play good defense, but how fresh are his legs going to be after going up against the press of Samford in the altitude and then playing whatever it's going to be like 36 hours later in this game. Number 2 is get out and transition. The negative of playing too big basketball, which is what Gonzaga basically does. I know Gregg is a flexible big man and, he shoots threes and everything, but Ike is not the fleetest of foot. Like, is that sometimes you're going to be able to get beat in transition. Kansas is now 9-1 after winning the Samford game in games with 72 or more possessions. They're 14-9 when it's 71 or less. So clearly Kansas has been a better team when they play at a higher tempo, when they play more possessions. And I think that makes a lot of sense. First of all, Kansas scores about 14 fast break points per game. That ranks in the 95th percentile per CBB analytics. That's over the last 5 games. And on the season, it's not far behind. Kansas isn't a great half-court offense. I mean, teams can sag in the paint because you have basically a couple non-shooters out. Like, Kansas hasn't been an elite half-court offense. So the more you can get out in transition, get easy buckets, and Kansas has a couple guys like Dajuan Harris and KJ Adams who kind of thrive in transition. Johnny Furphy, same way. He's better in transition than in the half-court game. That it makes sense that if Kansas can speed it up, it's going to benefit them. So for the Gonzaga side of things, you might be wondering, well, how do they do when the games are 72 or more possessions? Because actually, Gonzaga also scores about 14 transition points, or it's like 13 and a half transition points per game. So they've actually been a good transition scoring team. I think the thing I'm going to learn here is that maybe they're not a great transition defense because of playing the two bigs, though, because Gonzaga is only 7-4 in games of 72 or more possessions. On the flip side, they're 19-3 when it's played at 71 or less possessions. Now, even then, 7-4, that's still a winning record. Let's add some context into that. In games against KenPom top 150 opponents, so against the better part of the schedule for Gonzaga, top 150 opponents for Gonzaga, games with 72 or more possessions, Gonzaga is only 1-4. So when they've played good teams or decent teams and it has been a higher tempo game, Gonzaga is only 1-4. So if you can speed this game up, I think that benefits Kansas. Number 3 is scoring inside. Both are elite at scoring inside. This is strength on strength. Kansas ranks in the 95th percentile per CBB analytics in points in the paint per game at over 38 per game. Gonzaga ranks in the 100th percentile at 41.6 points in the paint per game. Specifically for Kansas, they've done it by shooting 69% at the rim. That's 96th percentile in the nation. But Gonzaga actually holds team below the national average for shots at the rim and how many they're getting, as well as slightly below the average for efficiency there. For the Gonzaga side of things, they've done it by shooting 72.5% at the rim. That's the very tip top of the country. But Kansas has typically been really good at preventing teams from even getting shots off at the rim. Teams are only shooting about 24% of their shots at the rim against the Kansas defense. The national average for teams shooting shots at the rim is 30%, which actually puts Kansas in the 96th percentile in preventing shots at the rim. So this is strength on strength. Whose strength is going to win out more? Maybe it just comes down to that. Maybe it comes down to, both teams kind of similar in a little bit of a way there and getting shots at the rim. Who can execute better and make the layups at the rim? Number 4, KU hitting mid-range shots, because as much as the at the rim stuff is important, Gonzaga, as a lot of teams do, a lot of teams are going to sag in the paint against Kansas. They're going to, try to congest the interior and the lane against Kansas. And for Gonzaga, if they're congesting the paint and sagging two big men there, that becomes more of a problem than a team who plays one center and a 6'6" wing at the 4. Because for Gonzaga, it's 6'10" and 6'9", and two guys who, in EK, he's a very strong dude, and Ben Gregg's like 230 pounds. Where that sagging up the paint is even more of a problem for Kansas. And Gonzaga actually gives up a decent amount of mid-range shots for CBB analytics. So enter KJ Adams short rolls and push shots. Enter Hunter Dickinson pick and pops from the mid-range and from 3. They're going to get some looks, but you got to make them in this game. For what it's worth, Kansas is actually in the 99th percentile over their last 5 games, and they're in the 96th percentile for a bigger sample over the last 10 games in 2-point field goal percentage in the paint, but not at the rim. So basically the shots that are not within the 4 feet of the rim or whatever it is. They're also above average on the season in mid-range, 60th percentile in mid-range twos. So they have shown the ability to make these types of shots. You're probably going to get a little bit more of them in this game than you did in the Sanford game. Our player matchup, I think it'd be very easy to pick Hunter Dickinson versus Graham Ike. It's going to be a great matchup. You have two bigs who are so good with their back to the basket, so good in posting up, so efficient scoring the basketball in a day and age where, there has been a lack of efficiency in terms of the post-ups compared to some other shots you can get. But they're going to run offenses through both guys. But I actually think the biggest one here is Dajuan Harris versus Ryan Nembhard. Ryan Nembhard is on an absolute heater for Gonzaga, playing great basketball. Dajuan Harris, when he's on, locked in, playing great defense, that's going to make it a lot tougher on Ryan Nembhard. Now, on the flip side, Dajuan Harris has scored double-digit points in 3 straight NCAA tournament games. What can Nembhard do on the defensive side of the ball to interrupt Dajuan Harris? I think whichever point guard plays better in this game or disrupts the other a little bit more, that could very well end up who comes out on top in the game, maybe more than any other player matchup in this one. All right, let's continue on with our Hawks to Soar KU players we think are set up for big games on this episode of Locked on Jayhawks. Fire TV is your destination for sports, from live games to highlights to in-depth analysis. Fire TV offers amazing viewing experiences with smart TVs, as well as the Fire TV stick that you can plug into existing TV that provides access to millions of movies and TV episodes, as well as free and live TV. Whether it's opening weekend for baseball or the college basketball tournament, you're going to want to have a Fire TV. Fire TV recently created Fire TV channels to deliver a constant supply of the latest videos from your favorite sports brands, all for free. That includes all of us at Locked On and most of the big pro leagues and college conferences as well. Fire TV channels lets you dive into all the game analysis, highlights, and more to keep up to date on all the latest in the world of sports, March Madness, NBA, MLB, and lots more, not to mention great news, entertainment, gaming, travel, cooking videos as well. Check out Fire TV channels on Fire TV and Alexa devices. If you haven't checked out Fire TV channels, you should. Trust me on this. To learn more, visit www.amazon.com/lockedonfiretv. Hawks to soar for Kansas. I guess I also wanted to touch real quickly on the KU women's basketball game because they're going to be in the NCAA tournament. That'll actually be tomorrow at 1 o'clock, taking on Michigan. So we'll be keeping an eye on that and what happens there. But Hawks to soar for KU. Jayhawks, we think, can stand out in this one. I am going to go Hunter Dickinson. It is more of his style of matchup. H.O.R., whatever. He was kind of a problem for Kansas, how they wanted to defend. They also had the backup big man who was like 6 of 25 from 3 on the year, go 4 of 4. But that's what's going to happen more often when you have a big man who can't really get out and defend threes and isn't a great defender. Now, this one in space, Hunter, though, if he has a more traditional big man matchup, is actually like an okay defender because he's 7'2" and he's big. So if you just have a traditional big man who's not running around him, who's not the most athletic guy in the world, even like an Yves Missi, who's a good rim roller, can be a problem for him. EK is more of the back to the basket guy. So I think in a certain way, this is going to make Hunter more comfortable. And then on the flip side, EK's a strong dude, but Hunter Dickinson has a weight advantage on him. Hunter Dickinson has a 4 to 5 inch advantage on him. I think Hunter Dickinson can have a good game. Plus, he's going to get pick and pop opportunities for Kansas in this one. Nick Timberlake is the other one. Just had an excellent scoring game in the NCAA tournament for Kansas. It's new life for him. You know, it's a new opportunity. You start fresh in the NCAA tournament, and I think he took advantage of that. Well, Gonzaga gives up 42.5% on corner threes this season. So they have not been great at defending corner threes. Nick Timberlake, through all his ups and downs this year, through his struggles and successes, he has been actually really good from corner threes. He's struggled on the above the break threes, the ones that are around the curve. Only 22.9% from 3 for Nick Timberlake on above the break threes, but 39.5% on corner threes. And that's what Gonzaga gives up more of. Now, Furphy's a good corner three-point shooter as well, but I'm worried that Anton Watson, who's an excellent defender, might take him away a little bit more. I think Nick Timberlake's set up to have another big game for KU. That'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. You can find our show anywhere you get your podcasts, including on our YouTube page. We'll see you next time with LOJ to recap whatever happens in the Kansas Gonzaga game.